When a lion walks into the savannah, the silence that follows is not peace, it's a warning. In Burkina Faso, that silence was broken at dawn, not by the sound of gunfire, but by a single scream. They've come again. It wasn't a rumor. It was a pattern. For the 21st time since 2022, the life of one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, was hunted. Not in secret anymore, not from the shadows, but in daylight, near the presidential palace, with men equipped in foreign gear and trained with foreign hands. But this is not a story about an ambush. It's a story about what happens when bullets meet flesh that does not retreat. The attackers expected confusion. Instead, they found resistance, not from elite guards or armored divisions, but from barefoot market women, from children with sticks, from taxi drivers blocking streets with their own vehicles. In less than 10 minutes, the road to the palace became impassable, not with concrete, but with bodies willing to bleed. They came to kill a man. They found a fortress made of flesh. Traoré did not run. He did not hide. He walked out onto the balcony and raised his fist, not in defiance, but in clarity. Burkina Faso is not afraid of death, he declared, only of losing freedom. And just like that, the crowd answered, not with fear, but with fury. The chant tore through the city like a storm. Freedom or death. Across the Sahel, people watched not with pity, but with pride. In Mali, farmers lifted radios to the sky. In Niger, women wept, not from grief, but from memory. They had seen this before. Lumumba, Sankara, Gaddafi. But this time, the knife met stone. This time, the story did not end with a bullet. It began with a vow. And now, one question carves itself into the heart of the continent. A knife's edge separates victory from ruin, so which side will it cut? The assassination plot before dawn. A strange wind swept through the red dust alleys of Ouagadougou, but this was no seasonal breeze. It was the breath of something Burkina Faso knows too well, the scent of death approaching. No one needed to ask, who's coming? Because in this land, scarred by more than 20 assassination attempts in less than 3 years, the shadow of the killer is no longer a mystery. It is the opening note in a familiar melody, a melody orchestrated by empires, conducted by intervention, and disguised as stability. Written not in Ouagadougou, but in Paris and Washington. At 5:27 a.m., a convoy of unmarked vehicles turned onto the southern approach to the presidential palace. No sirens, no panic, just cold precision. Inside were men who spoke no words. Satellite uplinks glowed on their wrists. Infrared lenses shimmered under their helmets. These were not rebels, not mercenaries. These were specialists, trained, funded, and deployed. Their target was not a man. It was a vision, a dangerous dream to those who had grown fat from Africa's obedience. But as they neared the final checkpoint, something no one had accounted for happened. 3 street sweepers, 2 young boys selling bread, frozen in place. One woman, barely in her 30s, headscarf half fallen, dropped her broom and screamed, "They're back for our president." The scream cracked like thunder across the city, but no one ran away. They ran toward the danger. Within 6 minutes, over 400 civilians flooded the streets. The butcher grabbed his cleaver. A truck driver blocked the intersection. Children banged on pans. Mothers raised their cooking pots like ancient shields. The streets turned into trenches. One attacker, caught on camera, threw a flash grenade, not to attack, but to escape. The operation collapsed. No bullets were fired. No army responded, because the people got there first. At 5:41 a.m., Ibrahim Traoré emerged. No body armor, no security glass, just a man in sleepwear, barefoot on cold marble. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He said one thing: "We are not afraid to die. We are only afraid of losing freedom." And that phrase cut through the morning like a blade. From a quiet corner, a voice echoed, "Freedom or death." Then 10, then 100, then the entire city. Freedom or death, freedom or death. Phones lit up, videos exploded across the continent. In Mali, people froze mid-breakfast. In Niger, cab drivers turned up the radio. In Ghana, students raised fists from their balconies. An entire continent watched something they thought had died with Sankara. In Paris and Washington, red phones rang, diplomatic memos were stamped urgent, and a painful truth sank into powerful hearts. They underestimated Traore. And worse, they underestimated the people of Burkina Faso. When empires blink and the people roar, the world expected silence after the failed strike. But instead of retreat, they heard thunder, not from missiles, from mouths. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, the cry, "Freedom or death," echoed louder than any presidential address. It did not come from radio hosts or generals. It came from grandmothers with bent backs, from mechanics covered in oil, from students who had never seen peace but knew its worth by absence. Ibrahim Traoré did not hide. He stood again that evening, this time dressed not in military uniform, but in a simple brown shirt, the color of the earth. His voice was firm, not fiery. His message: "We must think like Sours, not for this season, but for the next. Freedom is never a gift. It is a fortress built with blood, intelligence, and discipline." And the fortress stood. Overnight, Ouagadougou transformed. Street vendors formed civilian patrols with whistles and flashlights. Motorbike taxis rotated in shifts, watching every entrance to key neighborhoods. Teachers turned classrooms into emergency shelters. Blacksmiths forged blades, not for war, but for symbolism. On walls across the city, slogans appeared. "The bullet failed, now we plant seeds." This was not panic. This was preparation. A people moving as one body, defending not just a leader, but the future. But for every wall built by flesh and will, there came a whisper of betrayal. Within 24 hours, Burkina Faso's intelligence services confirmed a chilling discovery. Someone within the president's inner circle had leaked details of his movements. Not just dates, but satellite routes, floor plans, guard rotations, and the truth pierced deeper than any bullet. The enemy wasn't just outside the gates. He was wearing the same uniform. The betrayal triggered a nationwide audit of loyalty. Confidential documents were reviewed, phones seized. One colonel disappeared before dawn. His last known location: crossing into a neighboring state with a USB drive containing uranium production data. It was a dagger in the back. Traoré addressed the nation again, his third appearance in 24 hours. "The strongest enemy," he said, "is not the one facing us with a gun, but the one wearing our shirt, hiding a knife behind his back." He did not call for vengeance. He called for clarity. Across Africa, reactions split like lightning. In Mali, a minister declared, if they come for him, they come for all of us. In Niger, state television called the plot a foreign operation cloaked in local uniforms. In Senegal, the press warned, a Sahel rising too fast will be made to fall. But in Ghana, a parliamentarian sneered, "Traoré is dangerous. His fire will burn us all." Outside the continent, the air thickened. The French press called the resistance a symptom of dictatorship. The British media asked if populist militarism had returned to Africa. The U.S. State Department released a statement calling for restraint and restoration of democratic norms. But none could explain why a man with no navy, no nuclear program, no offshore assets, had survived 21 assassination attempts and still stood. Their silence, in truth, was admission. Their restraint was fear. And as sanctions tightened and threats multiplied, something even more unexpected happened. Ordinary people, farmers, welders, artists, started guarding the presidency around the clock. By day, they sang. By night, they stood in silent circles, hands linked. No weapons, just presence. A fortress of flesh, willing to bleed so a future could live. When loyalty becomes a weapon, and betrayal fires blanks the next morning. Ouagadougou looked normal. Markets opened. Children went to school. Farmers brought their harvest into the city. But this was not peace. It was the silence of a city that had stared death in the face and refused to blink. The failed assassination didn't just shake the palace. It exposed a truth no one inside the regime wanted to admit. Burkina Faso had entered a new phase of existential struggle. The first impact was economic. Foreign credit lines were cut. Again, sanctions tightened like a noose around an already fragile trade system. Banking restrictions made importing fuel, medicine, and food nearly impossible. Gas prices surged. Charcoal vendors complained of empty stockpiles. A landlocked nation felt the squeeze like a slow-motion siege. In another era, these tactics might have broken the will of a small, vulnerable state. But this time, the people didn't bend. They turned inward. They rose. Farmers pledged to expand their fields. Village elders launched a national movement. Eat what we grow what we eat. Tailors ditched imported fabrics for traditional cloth. Motorists switched to bicycles. It wasn't just survival. It was a declaration of independence. The second impact was social. The assassination attempt exposed the nation's vulnerability, but instead of fear, it ignited a civic awakening. Women formed night patrols with whistles and drums. Teachers trained students to identify strangers and raise alarms. Young men joined volunteer defense units. Elders dusted off ancient maps and offered strategic counsel. A new social fabric emerged, woven with vigilance and collective duty. But the most dangerous fallout wasn't external. It lay within the state itself. As the investigation deepened, reports surfaced. Confidential uranium program files had been stolen and smuggled across borders, and not by foreign spies, by senior officers once sworn to protect the flag. The deepest pain didn't come from the enemy's hand. It came from the smile of a traitor in uniform. Traore didn't scream. He didn't rage. He stood alone before the camera, dark background, the light rising from below. His voice was low, each word dropping like stones into a still lake. The most dangerous enemy does not come from outside. He comes from within the camp, wearing our hat, hiding a knife behind his back. That phrase became a mantra. Families whispered it at dinner. Neighborhoods etched it into gates. Soldiers carved it into rifle stocks. Because this was no longer a fight between a state and external enemies. It was a war between trust and betrayal. The government reacted like a wounded body under attack. It tightened its immune system. Surveillance expanded. Community watchdog groups multiplied. The press, already strained, came under heavier control. Critics called it oppression. Supporters called it wartime armor. But the reality was simple. Every assassination attempt didn't weaken Traore, it made him stronger. Because the people didn't see arrogance in his visibility. They saw trust. They saw a man who showed up. A man who didn't hide. An old revolutionary, his hands shaking, eyes sharp, spoke on national television. They killed Traore because he dared to dream. This time, we will not let history repeat. That line, raw, unscripted, Unstoppable became a vow no bullet could erase. The world reacts when giants circle a bonfire far beyond Ouagadougou. The failed assassination rippled like a stone cast into global waters. In Washington, urgency wrapped itself in diplomatic language. Burkina Faso was placed on a special watch list, citing regional instability and nuclear safety. But everyone in the room understood what it really meant: a green light for intervention, cloaked in concern. The U.S. State Department warned that Traoré's leadership was destabilizing West Africa, freezing aid and suspending trade. Behind closed doors, generals whispered about strategic recalibration and counter-narratives. In Paris, the response was colder, like a hand withdrawing a glove before a slap. Commercial ties were severed, credit lines dissolved overnight. French media repeated a single word like a drumbeat: dictator. Editorials warned of a rogue regime threatening the region, comparing Traoré to past strong men. But for every insult printed in Paris, another flag of Burkina Faso was raised in Bamako. In Moscow, the tone was thunder. Russian officials condemned the assassination attempt as an attack on African sovereignty. State media aired documentaries about colonial scars, while commentators declared Traoré a symbol of new African alignment. Beijing followed with silence first, then a handshake. Chinese envoys promised infrastructure, food security, and non-interference. Their message was simple: we don't ask who you vote for, just what you need built. But the most startling reaction came from the unlikeliest corner: Pyongyang. Reports confirmed that 700 North Korean commandos were discreetly deployed to reinforce the capital, not to fight, but to train. Urban defense, counter-drone tactics, fortification. Their arrival sent a message: Burkina Faso is no longer isolated. International media spun the story with familiar venom. CNN spoke of civilian manipulation. BBC called it authoritarian theater. Le Monde framed the People's Defense as mass delusion, but none could explain the one image that refused to disappear: unarmed farmers forming a human shield around the palace gates. As a barefoot president raised his fist to the sky, the United Nations convened. Western blocs demanded condemnation, but vetoes from Russia and China deadlocked the halls of power. A miniature Cold War unfolded in real time over one nation, one man, and one message: Africa will not kneel. And yet, the world's most dangerous question now loomed larger than ever. If 21 assassination attempts failed, if sanctions broke no spirit, if propaganda stirred no fear, then what comes next? Burkina Faso, once a footnote in foreign policy memos, had become a fault line, a crack in the old world order. And the giants were no longer just watching, they were circling. What comes next? The lion's choice at the edge of the fire, as the smoke of the attempted assassination faded into the Sahel sky. One question remained, not whispered in fear, but shouted in defiance: what now? Burkina Faso stands at a forked path, not only for itself, but for an entire continent watching with clenched fists and held breath. The first path is surrender. If sanctions tighten beyond breaking, if betrayal continues to bleed the inside, and if international isolation closes the gates too tight, Burkina Faso may be dragged back into the orbit of foreign control. Aid will return, but with chains. Troops will land, but with maps drawn in embassies. The script will be handed down again, from Paris, from Washington, from boardrooms that never learned to pronounce Ouagadougou. This path would mean safety, but no soul. The second path is resistance. Here lies hunger, uncertainty, and storms of propaganda. but also the thrill of walking on one's own feet. It means building with those who don't demand submission as payment. It means alliances of respect, not orders. It means being poor, perhaps, but free. This is the fire Traore lit. And now, every village, every family, every heart must decide, feed the flame or extinguish it, because this moment is bigger than Traore. His survival is no longer just biological, it is symbolic. He is the face of a question the West has refused to answer for 60 years. Can Africa lead itself? If Burkina Faso succeeds, it won't just escape colonization's shadow. It will cast a new one onto every nation still shackled by silence. But if it falls, it will be more than the death of a leader. It will be a signal to every empire that bullets still work, that unity can be shattered, that dreams die quietly in the dirt. And so, a choice now stands before an entire people. Do they turn inward, fear the night, and wait for rescue? Or do they stand barefoot, under stars, with fists raised, and say, "We are the rescue, we are the storm"? Across Africa, the youth are no longer asking for permission. They are reclaiming names, rewriting flags, building barricades not of concrete, but conviction. The ghosts of Lumumba, Sankara, and Gaddafi are no longer mourned. They are marching again. Their blood became ink. Now the continent writes a new chapter. And if you, watching from afar, feel this fire, don't let it die in silence. Speak it, share it, write your name beside it. Because what began in a street in Ouagadougou might end on the battlefield of history, where the lion must choose, die in a cage or burn in the open, roaring to the heavens. Freedom or death is no longer a slogan. It is the continent's vow. Which side of the fire will you stand on?